Deep in the mountains of Montana, where winter winds howl through pine forests and snow blankets the earth for months at a time, there once stood a prisoner of war camp that held secrets darker than the longest night. What happened there in the winter of 1943 would challenge everything we think we know about honor, duty, and the choices we make when nobody is watching. Picture this. You are a young American soldier, barely 20 years old, stationed at a remote facility where your job is simple. Guard the enemy. Keep them contained. Follow orders without question. The prisoners behind the barbed wire fence are not your friends. They are not your brothers. They are the very people your country is fighting against in a war that has already claimed millions of lives. But what happens when one of those prisoners collapses in the snow? What happens when you see him struggling to breathe, clutching his chest, his face turning blue from the bitter cold? Do you follow protocol and let nature take its course? Do you remember your training and walk away? Or do you risk everything you have sworn to protect for a man who should be your enemy? This is not a story about war as we usually tell it. This is not about heroes charging across battlefields or dramatic last stands that change the course of history. This is about something far more complex and far more human. This is about Private James Sullivan, a farm boy from Nebraska who found himself facing the most difficult decision of his young life on a frozen morning in Montana. The year was 1943, and America was deep in the fight of its life. Young men were dying on beaches in the Pacific and in the mountains of Italy. Families were rationing everything from sugar to gasoline. Everyone was making sacrifices. Everyone was doing their part, and James Sullivan was doing his part by serving as a guard at Camp Henderson, a prisoner of war facility tucked away in the wilderness where few people would ever think to look. Camp Henderson was not like the prisoner camps you might imagine from movies or books. It was not a sprawling complex with hundreds of buildings and thousands of prisoners. It was smaller, more isolated, designed to hold perhaps 200 men who had been captured during various operations across the European theater. The men inside those fences were German soldiers, most of them young like Sullivan himself, most of them far from home and wondering if they would ever see their families again. The camp was surrounded by mountains that stretched endlessly in every direction, their peaks covered in snow that never seemed to melt completely even in summer. The nearest town was 40 miles away down a winding road that became impassable during heavy snowfall. When winter arrived in Montana, it arrived with a vengeance that could last for months. The guards and prisoners alike were trapped together in that remote valley, dependent on supply trucks that sometimes could not make the journey for weeks at a time. James Sullivan had been at Camp Henderson for 8 months when our story begins. He had arrived in the spring when the wildflowers were blooming and the streams were running high with snowmelt. He had watched summer turn to autumn, had seen the leaves change colors and fall from the trees. He had watched the first snows arrive in October, light dustings that melted by afternoon. But November brought something different. November brought the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. Sullivan was not supposed to be in Montana at all. He had enlisted expecting to be shipped overseas like most of his friends from back home. He had trained for combat, had prepared himself mentally for the battles he thought he would face. Instead, he found himself assigned to guard duty in a place so remote that most people had never heard of it. At first, he had been disappointed. He wanted to serve his country in a way that mattered, in a way that would make a difference in the war effort. But as the months passed, Sullivan began to understand that his assignment was more important than he had initially realized. The prisoners at Camp Henderson were not ordinary soldiers. They were men who possessed valuable information about German operations, men who had been involved in planning and logistics, men who might hold keys to understanding enemy strategies. They were being held not just to keep them out of the fight, but to potentially extract intelligence that could save American lives. The guards at Camp Henderson were carefully selected for their reliability and their discretion. They were men who could be trusted to follow orders without asking too many questions. They were men who understood that what happened at the camp was classified information that could never be shared with anyone, not even their own families. Sullivan had signed papers that made it clear his silence was not optional. It was a requirement of his service. Life at the camp followed a rigid routine that never varied. The guards worked in shifts around the clock, maintaining constant surveillance of the prisoners. They conducted regular head counts, supervised work details, and ensured that camp regulations were followed to the letter. The prisoners were given basic necessities, but nothing more. They received adequate food, clean water, and shelter from the elements. They were not mistreated, but they were not shown any kindness either. Sullivan had been trained to maintain emotional distance from the men he was guarding. He had been told repeatedly that fraternization with prisoners was strictly forbidden. He was not to engage in unnecessary conversation. He was not to show sympathy or concern for their welfare beyond what regulations required. He was to remember at all times that these men were enemies of the United States, and that any compassion he might feel was misplaced and potentially dangerous. For months, Sullivan had followed these instructions without question. He had performed his duties with the mechanical precision that was expected of him. He had watched the prisoners go about their daily routines without really seeing them as individuals. They were simply numbers to be counted, bodies to be monitored, problems to be contained. But something began to change as winter deepened, and the isolation of the camp became more pronounced. Perhaps it was the long hours of standing guard in the bitter cold. Perhaps it was the way the prisoners huddled together for warmth during their outdoor exercise periods. Perhaps it was simply the reality that all of them, guards and prisoners alike, were young men far from home, enduring hardships that none of them had chosen. Sullivan began to notice things he had trained himself to ignore. He began to see that the prisoners were not the faceless enemy he had been taught to fear. They were individuals with their own personalities, their own fears, their own hopes of someday returning to the lives they had left behind. Some of them were barely old enough to shave. Others had photographs of wives and children that they looked at when they thought nobody was watching. One prisoner in particular caught Sullivan's attention, though he tried not to acknowledge it even to himself. The man was about Sullivan's age, perhaps a year or two older, with fair hair and serious blue eyes that seemed to hold depths of sadness. His name was Klaus Weber, and he had been captured during the fighting in North Africa. Unlike many of the other prisoners who maintained their military bearing and kept to themselves, Weber seemed genuinely curious about America and Americans. Weber spoke excellent English, having studied at university before the war, and he had a habit of asking questions that caught Sullivan off guard. Not military questions or anything that might be construed as attempts to gather intelligence, but simple human questions about life in America, about Sullivan's family, about what it was like to grow up on a farm in Nebraska. At first, Sullivan had responded to these questions with silence or curt reminders that conversation was not permitted. But as the weeks passed and the isolation of their situation became more apparent, he found himself occasionally answering. Just brief responses, nothing that could be considered inappropriate, but enough to establish that they were two human beings sharing an extraordinary circumstance. Weber had been a student of literature before the war, and he sometimes quoted poetry in English, reciting lines from authors that Sullivan recognized from his own schooling. There was something almost surreal about standing guard on a frozen morning and hearing this German prisoner quote Walt Whitman or Robert Frost, his accent giving familiar words and unexpected music. The other guards had noticed Weber too, but their reactions were different from Sullivan's. Some of them viewed his intelligence and education with suspicion, wondering what kind of information he might be gathering through seemingly innocent observations. Others resented his obvious comfort with American culture, seeing it as a form of mockery or condescension. Sullivan found himself thinking about Weber during his off-duty hours, wondering what circumstances had brought this educated, thoughtful young man to a prisoner of war camp in Montana. He wondered about Weber's family, whether they knew where he was, whether they were alive or dead. He wondered what Weber thought about during the long hours of confinement, what hopes or fears kept him awake at night. These thoughts troubled Sullivan because he knew they represented exactly the kind of emotional involvement he had been warned against. He was supposed to remain detached, professional, focused only on his duties as a guard. He was not supposed to care about the prisoners as individuals. He was certainly not supposed to feel any kind of connection or sympathy for them, athy for them. But caring was exactly what James Sullivan found himself doing as December arrived, with a fury that none of them had anticipated. The temperatures dropped so low that the metal of his rifle burned his hands even through thick gloves. The wind carried ice crystals that felt like needles against exposed skin. Supply trucks had not been able to make the journey in over 2 weeks, and food rations were running dangerously low for everyone at the camp. The prisoners were suffering more than the guards. Their barracks were older, less insulated, and the heating system struggled to keep the buildings warm enough to prevent frostbite. Sullivan could see their breath forming clouds even inside the buildings during his inspection rounds. Some of the men had developed persistent coughs that echoed through the thin walls at night. Others showed signs of malnutrition as their bodies burned through calories trying to stay warm. Captain Morrison, the camp commander, had received word that relief supplies were being organized, but weather conditions made it impossible to predict when they might arrive. The nearest military installation was 300 miles away, and even aircraft could not safely navigate the mountain passes in the current conditions. They were truly isolated, cut off from the outside world in a way that made their situation feel almost prehistoric. During this time, Sullivan noticed that Klaus Weber had begun to look different. The intellectual curiosity that had once animated his conversations was fading. His face had taken on a gaunt appearance that spoke of too little food and too much cold. His hands shook when he thought nobody was looking, and he had developed a persistent cough that seemed to be getting worse each day. Weber was not the only prisoner showing signs of serious distress, but something about his condition particularly troubled Sullivan. Perhaps it was because Weber had never complained, never asked for special treatment, never shown anything but quiet dignity in the face of circumstances that would have broken many men. Or perhaps it was simply that Sullivan had come to see him as a person, rather than just another enemy to be guarded. The crisis came on a morning when the thermometer outside the guard station read 37 degrees below zero. Sullivan was beginning his early shift, making his rounds through the compound before the prisoners were scheduled to wake for their morning meal. The snow crunched under his boots with a sound like breaking glass, and his breath formed clouds that froze and fell to the ground as ice crystals. He was approaching the prisoner barracks when he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. It was a sound of struggle, of someone fighting for breath. At first, he thought it might be an animal caught in the wire fencing that surrounded the compound, but as he listened more carefully, he realized it was coming from inside one of the buildings. Sullivan approached the nearest window and peered through the frost-covered glass. What he saw inside made his blood run cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Klaus Weber was on the floor beside his bunk, his body convulsing as he struggled to breathe. His lips were blue and his eyes were wide with panic as his lungs fought to draw in air that seemed too cold and too thin to sustain life. The other prisoners in the barracks were awake now, clustering around Weber and speaking in urgent whispers. Some of them were calling for help, but their voices were too weak to carry through the thick walls and over the howling wind. They looked toward the window where Sullivan stood, their faces desperate with the kind of fear that transcends nationality or politics. According to camp regulations, Sullivan should have immediately alerted the duty officer and waited for instructions. Medical emergencies involving prisoners were to be handled through proper channels with appropriate authorization and documentation. Guards were not permitted to enter prisoner barracks without backup and direct orders from a superior officer. But Sullivan could see that Weber was dying. The man's breathing was becoming more labored with each passing moment, and his skin was taking on a bluish tinge that spoke of oxygen deprivation. There was no time to follow protocol. There was no time to wake the duty officer or call for backup or fill out the proper forms. Sullivan made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, though not in the way he expected. He abandoned his post, broke camp regulations and entered the prisoner barracks without authorization. He knelt beside Weber and began to assess his condition with the basic first aid training he had received during his military preparation. Weber's pulse was rapid and weak. His breathing was shallow and irregular. His body temperature felt dangerously low, and Sullivan could see signs of severe hypothermia setting in. The man needed immediate medical attention, but the camp's medical officer was not scheduled to arrive for his weekly visit for another 3 days. The other prisoners watched in amazement as Sullivan began to work. He removed his own heavy coat and wrapped it around Weber, then began the process of trying to warm the man's core temperature. He sent one of the prisoners to fetch blankets while he worked to stabilize Weber's breathing. What Sullivan was doing went against every regulation in the military handbook. He was risking his career, his freedom, and possibly his life to save a man who was supposed to be his enemy. He was showing compassion to someone he had been trained to view as a threat to everything he held dear. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Klaus Weber was a human being who was dying, and James Sullivan had the knowledge and the opportunity to save his life. Everything else was secondary to that simple, powerful truth. As Sullivan worked, he became aware that other guards had arrived. He could hear voices outside the barracks, urgent conversations about what to do with a guard who had clearly violated his orders. He knew that his actions would have consequences, that he would have to answer for his decision to prioritize human life over military protocol. Weber's breathing began to stabilize as his body temperature slowly rose. Color started to return to his face, and his pulse became stronger and more regular. Sullivan could see awareness returning to the man's eyes, could see him trying to focus on the face of the American soldier who was saving his life. The irony was not lost on either of them. Here was a German prisoner of war being saved by an American guard who was risking everything to help him. Here were two young men from opposing sides of the most destructive conflict in human history, connected by an act of mercy that transcended all the hatred and fear that had brought them to this place. When Weber was finally stable enough to speak, his first words were not what Sullivan expected. He did not thank Sullivan for saving his life. Instead, he looked directly into Sullivan's eyes and asked a question that would echo in the guard's mind for decades to come. "Why?" Weber whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that continued to howl outside. "Why would you risk everything for me?" Sullivan had no answer. He had acted on instinct, on something deeper than training or protocol or political ideology. He had acted on the fundamental recognition that life has value regardless of nationality or uniform or the circumstances that bring people together. Captain Morrison arrived at the barracks just as Sullivan was finishing his makeshift medical treatment. The commander's face was grim as he surveyed the scene before him. Here was one of his guards, out of position and in clear violation of regulations, providing aid to an enemy prisoner without authorization. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Every person in that room understood that Sullivan's military career was likely over. He had broken faith with his orders, had shown compassion where none was authorized, had chosen individual conscience over collective duty. But Weber was alive. That fact hung in the air like a challenge to everything they had been taught about war and enemies and the proper conduct of soldiers. Weber was alive because James Sullivan had chosen to see him as a human being rather than as a symbol of everything America was fighting against. Morrison looked from Sullivan to Weber and back again. His expression was unreadable, but Sullivan could sense the wheels turning in his superior officer's mind. This was not a situation covered in any manual or regulation. This was a moment where human judgment would have to suffice, where official policy provided no guidance. "Get him to the medical station," Morrison finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "And you," he continued, looking directly at Sullivan, "report to my office when you're finished here." As Sullivan helped carry Weber to the camp's small medical facility, he wondered what his future would hold. He had saved a man's life, but he had also violated the trust placed in him by his country and his fellow soldiers. He had acted with compassion, but he had also acted without authorization in a way that could be seen as aiding the enemy. The other prisoners watched silently as Weber was carried away. Some of them nodded slightly to Sullivan as he passed, a subtle acknowledgement of what he had done. Others looked away, perhaps embarrassed by the kindness they had witnessed, perhaps fearful of what it might mean for all of them. Weber himself said nothing more as they transported him to the medical station, but his eyes never left Sullivan's face. There was something in that gaze that spoke of profound gratitude, but also of profound confusion. Like Sullivan, Weber was trying to understand what had just happened, trying to reconcile this act of mercy with everything he thought he knew about the nature of war. He knew about the nature of war. The medical station at Camp Henderson was little more than a converted storage room with basic supplies and a single cot. Sullivan helped settle Weber onto the narrow bed, pulling blankets up to his chin as the German's body continued to fight off the effects of severe hypothermia. The small space felt cramped with both men inside, and Sullivan found himself acutely aware of how alone they were in this moment. Weber's breathing had steadied, but his eyes remained fixed on Sullivan with an intensity that made the young guard uncomfortable. There was something almost accusing in that stare, as if Weber was searching for some hidden motive behind the rescue. As if kindness from an enemy was somehow more suspicious than cruelty would have been. "You did not answer my question," Weber said quietly, his accent making the words sound formal and precise. "Why would you do this thing?" Sullivan busied himself checking the blankets, avoiding direct eye contact. Any decent person would have done the same thing. Would they? Weber's voice carried a note of skepticism that cut through the warm air of the medical station. "I have been prisoner here for many months. I have watched your fellow guards. I do not think all of them would make the choice you made this morning." The truth of that statement settled heavily in the room between them. Sullivan knew that Weber was right. Some of the other guards might have followed protocol exactly, might have let nature take its course rather than risk their careers for an enemy soldier. Some might have seen Weber's collapse as a problem solving itself. "I don't know why I did it," Sullivan admitted finally. "I just knew I couldn't watch you die." Weber was quiet for a long moment, studying Sullivan's face as if trying to memorize every detail. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost thoughtful. "Before the war, I wanted to teach children literature and poetry. I believed that words could build bridges between people, that stories could help us understand each other." He paused, coughing slightly. "The war has shown me how easily those bridges can be burned." Sullivan found himself drawn into the conversation, despite his better judgment. "What changed your mind?" "I have seen what men do to each other when they are told that others are not human. I have seen ordinary people become monsters because they were given permission to stop seeing their enemies as people." Weber's eyes grew distant. "But today, you reminded me that some bridges cannot be burned. Some part of our humanity survives even in the darkest places." The sound of boots on frozen ground outside the medical station interrupted their conversation. Sullivan straightened, knowing that his reckoning with Captain Morrison was about to begin. Whatever consequences awaited him, he would face them knowing that Klaus Weber was alive because of his choice. Morrison entered the small room with the measured steps of a man who had spent considerable time deciding what to say. His weathered face showed no emotion as he looked from Sullivan to Weber and back again. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before he finally spoke. "Weber, how are you feeling?" The German prisoner struggled to sit up straighter, showing the automatic respect that military training demanded even under these circumstances. "Better, sir. Much better." Morrison nodded curtly, then turned his full attention to Sullivan. "Private, step outside with me." The cold hit Sullivan like a physical blow as they emerged from the relative warmth of the medical station. Morrison walked several steps away from the building before turning to face his subordinate, his expression still unreadable. 12 years I've been in command of facilities like this," Morrison began, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. 12 years of managing prisoners, training guards, following regulations that were written by men who never had to look into the eyes of the people they were guarding. Sullivan remained at attention, unsure whether this was the beginning of a reprimand or something else entirely. "You know what you did wrong, Private?" "Yes, sir. I abandoned my post. I entered the prisoner barracks without authorization. I provided aid to an enemy combatant without following proper protocols." Morrison studied him for another long moment. "And knowing all that, would you do it again?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sullivan knew that his answer could determine not just his future in the military, but his understanding of who he was as a person. He thought about Weber's blue lips, about the panic in his eyes, about the other prisoners watching helplessly as their fellow human being fought for his life. "Yes, sir, I would." Morrison's expression shifted slightly, though Sullivan couldn't tell if it was approval or disappointment. The captain walked a few more steps away, looking out at the snow-covered mountains that surrounded their isolated outpost. "The supply convoy finally made radio contact an hour ago," Morrison said, seemingly changing the subject. "They'll be here within 2 days, weather permitting. We'll have adequate food and medical supplies again." Sullivan waited, knowing there was more coming. "Weber's condition could have deteriorated rapidly without immediate intervention. The camp medical officer confirmed that your actions likely saved his life." Morrison turned back to face Sullivan directly. "The question now is what we do about the fact that you violated direct orders to make that happen." The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around their feet. Sullivan could hear the distant sounds of the camp coming to life as other prisoners and guards began their daily routines. Life continuing as if the world hadn't shifted somehow in the space of a single morning. "There will be an official report," Morrison continued. "It will state that you responded to a medical emergency with appropriate speed and effectiveness. It will note that your actions were instrumental in preventing the death of a prisoner under our care." Sullivan felt a flutter of confusion. "Sir?" "What it will not mention is the specific regulations you broke in the process. Sometimes, Private, the right thing to do and the regulation thing to do are not the same thing. Sometimes, a commanding officer has to use his judgment about which reports get filed and which conversations never happened." The implications of Morrison's words slowly sank in. Sullivan was not going to be court-martialed. He was not going to face charges for his actions. His career would continue, his conscience clear. "However," Morrison's voice took on a sharper edge, "this cannot happen again. You cannot make a habit of freelancing when it comes to prisoner welfare. The regulations exist for good reasons, and most of the time they need to be followed exactly." "I understand, sir." Morrison looked toward the medical station where Weber was recovering. "The prisoner asked to speak with you again before he's returned to his barracks. I'm going to allow it, but there will be another guard present, and the conversation will be brief." As they walked back toward the medical station, Sullivan found himself wondering what Weber wanted to say. Their earlier conversation had revealed depths to the German soldier that complicated everything Sullivan thought he knew about enemies and allies, about the nature of war itself. Inside the medical station, Weber was sitting up on the edge of the cot, color fully returned to his face. He looked up as Morrison and Sullivan entered, followed by another guard who positioned himself near the door. "I wanted to thank you properly," Weber said, addressing Sullivan directly. "But also to give you something." Weber reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small piece of paper, folded many times until it was no bigger than a matchbook. He held it out to Sullivan with hands that no longer shook from cold or illness. Sullivan looked to Morrison, who nodded permission. He took the paper and unfolded it carefully, revealing lines of text written in careful English script. "It is a poem," Weber explained. "I wrote it during my first week here, when I was still angry and bitter about my capture. But this morning, I realized that anger was preventing me from seeing clearly." Sullivan read the poem silently, aware that both Morrison and the other guard were watching his reaction. The words spoke of loneliness and homesickness, but also of hope and the persistent belief that human goodness could survive even in the darkest circumstances. "Why are you giving this to me?" Sullivan asked. Weber stood slowly, still recovering his strength, but determined to deliver his message while standing. "Because you showed me that the war has not killed everything good in the world, because you reminded me that compassion is not weakness, even when it is dangerous." He paused, looking directly into Sullivan's eyes. "And because I want you to know that what you did this morning changed something in me. I will remember it for the rest of my life, however long or short that may be." Morrison cleared his throat, signaling that the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. "Weber, you'll be returned to your barracks this afternoon. The medical officer will check on you again tomorrow." As they prepared to leave, Weber spoke once more. "Private Sullivan, I hope that when this war ends, we will both be the kind of men who can build bridges instead of burning them." Sullivan folded the poem carefully and placed it in his own pocket. "I hope so, too." The walk back to the guard station was quiet, both Sullivan and Morrison lost in their own thoughts about what had transpired. The camp continued its daily routine around them, but something fundamental had shifted. The clear lines between friend and enemy had blurred in a way that would affect everyone who witnessed what happened. That evening, as Sullivan began his night shift, he found himself thinking about Weber's words about bridges and the choices that define who we become. He pulled the poem from his pocket and read it again by the light of his flashlight, struck by how similar the German soldier's hopes and fears were to his own. The other guards had heard about the morning's events, though the details had become confused in the retelling. Some viewed Sullivan as a hero who had saved a life. Others questioned whether he had shown too much sympathy for the enemy. All of them seemed to understand that something significant had happened, something that would be discussed and debated long after the war ended. Weber returned to his regular routine within the prisoner population, but Sullivan noticed that the other German soldiers treated him differently now. There was a new respect in their interactions, as if Weber had gained something valuable through his brush with death and Sullivan's intervention. The relationship between Sullivan and Weber also changed, though in subtle ways that were difficult to define. They no longer engaged in the casual conversations that had developed over the previous months. Both men seemed to understand that what had happened between them was too significant for ordinary dialogue. Instead, there were moments of acknowledgement. A brief nod when their paths crossed during daily routines. A slight smile when Weber caught Sullivan's eye during prisoner formations. These small gestures carried the weight of their shared experience, of the moment when two young men from opposing armies had connected as human beings. The supply convoy arrived 2 days later, bringing food, medicine, and news from the outside world. The war continued its grinding progression across Europe and the Pacific, consuming lives and resources at an almost incomprehensible rate. But within the isolated confines of Camp Henderson, something had changed that could not be measured in tactical advantages or strategic gains. Sullivan found himself viewing his duties differently in the weeks that followed. He still maintained the professional distance required by regulations, still followed orders with the precision expected of a military guard, but he could no longer see the prisoners as faceless enemies. Weber's collapse had forced him to confront the humanity of all the men behind the wire fence. This new awareness created its own challenges. Sullivan began to notice when prisoners appeared ill or injured. He found himself concerned about their welfare in ways that went beyond his official responsibilities. He had to constantly remind himself of the boundaries that separated appropriate concern from dangerous sympathy. The winter continued its relentless assault on Camp Henderson, bringing more storms and deeper cold. But the crisis had passed, both literally and figuratively. Weber had recovered completely from his brush with hypothermia. Sullivan had faced the consequences of his actions and emerged with his career intact. The camp had weathered its most difficult period and emerged stronger, yet questions remained that would follow both men long after the war ended. What obligations do we owe to our enemies when they are helpless, How do we balance military duty with human compassion? When is it right to break rules in service of a higher moral calling? These were not questions with easy answers, not problems that could be solved through regulations or training manuals. They were the fundamental challenges that arise when ordinary people find themselves in extraordinary circumstances, forced to choose between competing loyalties and values. As winter slowly gave way to spring, as the snow began to melt and reveal the green world beneath, Sullivan often thought about Weber's poem and its message about building bridges instead of burning them. The war would end eventually, and both men would return to the lives they had left behind. But they would carry with them the memory of a morning when one human being had chosen to save another, regardless of the uniform he wore or the flag he served. That moment of connection between Sullivan and Weber became a turning point that rippled through Camp Henderson in ways neither man could have anticipated. Word of what had happened spread quietly through both the guard quarters and the prisoner barracks, creating an atmosphere of unspoken understanding that challenged everyone's assumptions about loyalty and humanity. The other prisoners began to look at Sullivan differently during his patrol rounds. Where once there had been studied indifference or barely concealed hostility, now there were subtle signs of respect. A slight inclination of the head when he passed, eyes that met his without the usual wariness. These small gestures spoke volumes about how Weber had shared his experience with his fellow prisoners. Among the guards, reactions were more complex and divided. Sergeant Hayes, a career military man who had served in the trenches of the First War, pulled Sullivan aside one evening after duty. "What you did was dangerous, son," Hayes said, his weathered face serious in the lamplight. "Not just dangerous for your career, but dangerous for all of us here. You start showing that kind of mercy to one prisoner, and they all start expecting it. They start seeing weaknesses they can exploit." Sullivan listened respectfully, understanding that Hayes spoke from decades of military experience. But he also remembered Weber's blue lips, the desperation in his eyes, the fundamental human need for help that transcended politics and warfare. "With respect, Sergeant, I don't think helping someone who was dying makes me weak." Hayes studied him for a long moment. "Maybe not weak, but it makes you different from the rest of us. And different can be dangerous in a place like this." Other guards had different reactions. Corporal Martinez, who had grown up in a family of immigrants, approached Sullivan with quiet support. "My grandfather always told me that how we treat our enemies says more about who we are than how we treat our friends," Martinez said during a late-night shift change. "I think you did the right thing, even if it wasn't the regulation thing." These conversations forced Sullivan to examine his own motivations more deeply. Had he acted out of genuine compassion, or was there something else driving his decision? Was he trying to prove something to himself about what kind of man he was? Was he rebelling against the dehumanizing aspects of military life that had begun to wear on him after months of isolation? The questions became more complex when Captain Morrison called him into his office 3 weeks after the incident. Morrison's desk was covered with official correspondence, supply requisitions, and reports from higher command. But when he looked up at Sullivan, his expression carried a weight that had nothing to do with routine camp administration. "I've been thinking about what happened with Weber," Morrison began, gesturing for Sullivan to sit. "Not just the immediate incident, but what it means for how we operate this facility going forward." Sullivan waited, unsure what direction this conversation would take. "The thing is, Private, what you did has created a precedent. The prisoners know that at least one guard here will show mercy under extreme circumstances. The other guards know it too. That changes the dynamic in ways I'm still trying to understand." Morrison stood and walked to the window that looked out over the compound. In the distance, prisoners were conducting their daily exercise in the yard, moving in organized formations under the watchful eyes of armed guards. "I've received communications from command about prisoner welfare standards. Apparently there have been incidents at other facilities, prisoners dying from preventable causes, investigations being launched, questions being asked about how we treat men in our custody. Sullivan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana weather. "Are we in trouble, sir?" Morrison turned back from the window. "On the contrary, the fact that we've had no prisoner deaths, no serious medical incidents, no complaints about treatment is being noticed. Your actions, while technically against regulations, may have prevented exactly the kind of tragedy that's causing problems elsewhere." The implications of Morrison's words slowly sank in. Sullivan's moment of compassion had not just saved Weber's life. It had potentially protected the entire camp from the kind of scrutiny that could destroy careers and reputations. "What does that mean for how we do things going forward?" Morrison returned to his desk and pulled out a folder marked with official seals. "New guidelines from Washington. All prisoner medical emergencies are to be treated with the same urgency we would show for our own personnel. Guards are authorized to provide immediate aid without waiting for superior authorization if delay could result in loss of life." Sullivan stared at the folder, hardly believing what he was hearing. His violation of regulations had somehow become the template for new official policy. Of course, Morrison continued with a slight smile. "These new guidelines are dated 2 days before your incident with Weber. Funny how paperwork sometimes gets delayed in delivery, isn't it?" The captain's meaning was clear. Morrison had used his influence to protect Sullivan retroactively, creating an official justification for actions that had originally been unauthorized. It was a sophisticated manipulation of military bureaucracy in service of doing the right thing. As spring progressed and the snow continued its retreat from the mountains around Camp Henderson, the changes in atmosphere became more pronounced. The rigid separation between guards and prisoners began to show cracks that would have been unthinkable months earlier. It started with small things: a guard helping a prisoner who had stumbled while carrying supplies, another guard sharing his coffee with prisoners working outdoor details in unusually cold weather. These acts of basic human kindness were still exceptions rather than rules, but they represented a fundamental shift in how both sides viewed their relationship. Weber himself became something of an unofficial liaison between the prisoner population and camp administration. His education, language skills, and the respect he had gained through his near-death experience made him a natural choice when communication was needed about prisoner concerns or complaints. During one such meeting, Weber sat across from Morrison's desk while Sullivan stood guard near the door. The conversation was officially about food distribution schedules, but it evolved into something deeper. "Captain, may I speak freely about something that concerns all of us here?" Morrison nodded, curious about what Weber might say. "The war will end someday. When it does, those of us who survive will return to our homes and try to rebuild our lives. What we take with us from this experience will shape who we become in that new world." Weber paused, glancing briefly at Sullivan before continuing. "I have seen camps where prisoners and guards became enemies in ways that went beyond military necessity. I have heard stories of brutality and dehumanization that served no strategic purpose. But here, something different is happening. Here, we are learning that it is possible to maintain security and discipline while still recognizing each other's humanity." Morrison leaned back in his chair, considering Weber's words. "What exactly are you asking for?" "Nothing specific, sir. I am simply expressing gratitude for the way this camp is administered, and hoping that this approach will continue until the war ends and we can all go home." After Weber was escorted back to his barracks, Morrison sat quietly for several minutes, staring out his window at the compound where prisoners and guards continued their daily routines. Sullivan remained at attention, waiting for dismissal, but also sensing that his commander wanted to share his thoughts. 12 years I've been doing this job," Morrison finally said. "I've seen camps run like prisons, where every interaction was about power and control. I've seen camps run like country clubs, where discipline broke down and security became compromised. I've never seen anything quite like what's developing here." He turned to face Sullivan directly. "What you did that morning with Weber started something. I'm not sure yet whether it's something good or something dangerous. Maybe it's both." Sullivan found his voice. "Do you regret backing my decision, sir?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "Ask me that question when the war's over and we see what kind of men walk out of this place. Ask me when we know whether what we're doing here helps them become better people or just makes them better at hiding who they really are." The conversation stayed with Sullivan as he went about his duties in the following days. He began to pay closer attention to the interactions between guards and prisoners, trying to understand what Morrison meant about the changes taking place. He noticed that prisoner work details were being conducted with less tension than before. Guards were still vigilant and professional, but the atmosphere of barely contained hostility had diminished. Conversations between guards and prisoners were still limited and formal, but they were no longer conducted with the assumption that every word might be a threat or a trap. More significantly, Sullivan observed that the prisoners themselves seemed different. They maintained their military discipline and respect for the chain of command, but there was less of the sullen resentment that had characterized their behavior during his early months at the camp. They seemed to have developed a grudging respect for the way they were being treated. One evening, while conducting his rounds through the prisoner barracks, Sullivan overheard a conversation that gave him insight into how his actions had been interpreted by the German soldiers. Two younger prisoners were discussing their situation in voices they thought were too quiet to be overheard. "Hans thinks we will be here until the war ends," one was saying in accented English. "He thinks the Americans will never trust us enough to release us." "Maybe that is not so bad," the other replied. "At least here we are, treated as soldiers, not as animals. My cousin was captured by the Russians. His letters say things there are very different." "You think it is because of what happened with Klaus, when the guard saved his life? Perhaps. Or perhaps these Americans are simply different from what we were taught to expect. They follow their own rules even when those rules require them to show mercy to enemies." Sullivan continued his patrol, but the conversation stayed with him. The prisoners had interpreted his actions not as weakness or misplaced sympathy, but as evidence that Americans were bound by principles that transcended military advantage. It was a responsibility that felt both inspiring and terrifying. The weight of that responsibility became even clearer when a new group of prisoners arrived at Camp Henderson in late April. These men had been captured during recent fighting in Italy, and they brought with them fresh wounds and fresh anger about their situation. The new arrivals were suspicious of the relatively relaxed atmosphere they found at the camp. They had expected harsh treatment based on their own military's propaganda about American brutality toward prisoners. Instead, they found adequate food, clean facilities, and guards who treated them with professional respect rather than personal hatred. Some of the new prisoners interpreted this treatment as a sign of weakness, an opportunity to test the limits of what they could get away with. There were incidents of minor insubordination, attempts to organize protests about camp conditions, and efforts to gather intelligence about camp security procedures. Sullivan found himself in the middle of one such incident when a newly arrived prisoner named Fisher decided to challenge the authority of the guards during a routine inspection. Fisher had been a sergeant in the German army and clearly resented taking orders from what he saw as inferior American soldiers. "You Americans think you have won this war," Fisher said loudly during a barracks inspection, speaking in English to ensure he would be understood. "You think your soft treatment of prisoners shows your superiority, but weakness is weakness, no matter how you disguise it." The comment was clearly intended to provoke a reaction, to test whether the guards would respond with force or discipline. Other prisoners watched nervously, uncertain whether Fisher was about to bring trouble down on all of them. Sullivan felt the familiar tension that came with potential confrontation, but he also remembered Weber's words about building bridges instead of burning them. He stopped in front of Fisher and met the man's challenging stare directly. "Sergeant Fisher, you're entitled to your opinions about American military capabilities. You'll have plenty of time to think about them while you're here, but you'll express those opinions respectfully and you'll follow camp regulations while you're doing it." Fisher's eyes narrowed. And if I choose not to, then you'll discover that treating prisoners with dignity doesn't mean we're afraid to maintain discipline when necessary. The standoff lasted several tense seconds before Weber stepped forward from where he had been standing with the other prisoners. "Sergeant Fisher," Weber said quietly in German, then switched to English. "Perhaps you would like to hear about how things work here before you decide what kind of prisoner you want to be." Fisher looked from Sullivan to Weber and back again, clearly trying to understand the dynamic between them. Finally, he stepped back and assumed a position of attention. "My apologies for speaking out of turn," he said stiffly. The incident passed without further confrontation, but it highlighted the delicate balance that had developed at Camp Henderson. The respectful treatment of prisoners was not weakness, but it required constant vigilance to prevent it from being interpreted as such. Later that evening, Weber approached Sullivan during a quiet moment in the compound. "Thank you for handling Sergeant Fisher with patience," Weber said. "Some of the new men do not understand yet that respect can coexist with strength." Sullivan nodded. "It's not always easy to find that balance." "No, it is not, but it is worth the effort. The men who learn that lesson here will carry it with them when they return home. They will remember that enemies can treat each other with dignity, even in wartime." Weber paused, looking around the compound where prisoners and guards continued their evening routines. "I have been thinking about something you said months ago, about any decent person making the choice you made when I was dying. I think now that you were wrong about that." Sullivan looked at him questioningly. "Not every person would have made that choice. Many would have followed regulations exactly, would have let fear or hatred or simple indifference guide their actions. What you did required something more than decency. It required courage." The conversation ended there, but Weber's words stayed with Sullivan as he continued his duties. The realization that his actions had required courage rather than simple human decency added another layer of complexity to his understanding of what had happened that winter morning. The courage that Weber spoke of would be tested again before spring fully arrived at Camp Henderson. Word came through official channels that the war was entering what many believed might be its final phase. Allied forces were pushing deeper into German territory, and the stream of new prisoners had slowed to a trickle as German resistance began to crumble in some sectors. With this news came new tensions that Sullivan had not anticipated. Some of the longer-term prisoners, men who had been at the camp for over a year, began to show signs of depression and anxiety that went beyond simple homesickness. They were beginning to confront the possibility that the Germany they would return to might be fundamentally different from the one they had left behind. Weber was among those most affected by this realization. During their brief, sanctioned conversations, Sullivan noticed that the German's usual thoughtful composure was beginning to crack. His questions about American life became more urgent, as if he were trying to understand something essential about how societies rebuilt themselves after devastating conflicts. "Private Sullivan," Weber said during one such conversation, "what happens to a country when it discovers that everything it believed about itself was wrong?" The question caught Sullivan off guard. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean." Weber looked toward the mountains that surrounded the camp, his expression distant and troubled. "Before this war, I believed in my country. I believed we were fighting for something noble, something worth the sacrifices we were making. Now I hear rumors from new prisoners about things that were done in Germany's name, things that make me question whether the country I loved ever truly existed." Sullivan felt the weight of Weber's anguish but struggled to find appropriate words of response. This was not a conversation covered by any regulation or training manual. This was a human being grappling with the collapse of his fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. "Maybe the country you loved did exist," Sullivan offered carefully. "Maybe it still exists in people like you who care enough to ask these kinds of questions." Weber turned to look at him directly. "Do you truly believe that? Or are you simply trying to offer comfort to a man whose world has been destroyed?" The directness of the question demanded an equally direct answer. Sullivan thought about his own relationship with America, about the values he had been taught to defend, about whether those values could survive the compromises and moral ambiguities of wartime. "I believe that countries are made up of individual people making individual choices," he said finally. "What matters isn't what happened before, but what people like you choose to do when you get the chance to help rebuild." Weber nodded slowly, as if testing Sullivan's words against his own thoughts. "That is a hopeful way to see things. I pray that you are right." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Morrison, who had been making his evening rounds of the compound. He approached the two men with the measured stride that had become familiar to everyone at the camp. "Weber, how are you adjusting to the spring weather?" Morrison asked in the casual tone he had developed for interacting with the longer-term prisoners. "Very well, thank you, Captain. It is good to see the world coming back to life after such a harsh winter." Morrison nodded, then glanced at Sullivan. "Private, I need to speak with you when you finish your rounds." There was something in Morrison's tone that suggested this would be more than a routine conversation. Sullivan completed his patrol duties with a growing sense of unease, wondering what news Morrison might have received from higher command. When he reported to Morrison's office an hour later, Sullivan found his commander studying a collection of documents that bore the official seals of multiple military departments. Morrison looked up as Sullivan entered, his expression serious but not necessarily troubled. "Sit down, Private. We need to discuss some developments that will affect this entire facility." Sullivan took his seat, trying to read Morrison's mood from his body language and tone of voice. "I've received word that Camp Henderson is being considered for a new program, something that's never been tried before in American prisoner of war facilities." Morrison paused, organizing his thoughts. "The idea is to begin preparing long-term prisoners for eventual repatriation by involving them in educational and reconstruction planning activities." The concept was so unexpected that Sullivan struggled to understand its implications. "You mean teaching them about democracy, sir?" "Something like that. The theory is that prisoners who have been treated well and who understand American values might become advocates for democratic principles when they return home. Instead of sending back men who are bitter and resentful, we send back men who have seen that former enemies can coexist peacefully." Morrison stood and walked to his window, looking out at the compound where prisoners and guards were ending their daily routines. The program would be voluntary for prisoners. Those who participate would receive additional privileges and responsibilities. They would help with camp administration, assist in teaching English to newer prisoners, and participate in discussions about post-war reconstruction. Sullivan began to see the connection to his earlier actions. "This is related to what happened with Weber, isn't it?" Morrison turned back to face him. "Your incident with Weber demonstrated something that caught the attention of people in Washington. It showed that American soldiers could maintain security and discipline while still treating prisoners as human beings worthy of respect. It suggested that our approach here might be creating exactly the kind of relationships that could be useful after the war ends." The weight of responsibility that Sullivan had felt since that winter morning seemed to increase exponentially. His single act of compassion had somehow become the foundation for a new approach to prisoner management that could affect thousands of men. "What would my role be in this program, sir?" Morrison returned to his desk and pulled out another folder, this one marked with classification stamps that indicated its sensitive nature. "You would be promoted to corporal and given additional responsibilities for prisoner welfare and program administration. You would work directly with selected prisoners to implement the educational components of the program. You would also help train other guards in the techniques we've developed here." The promotion was unexpected and welcome, but Sullivan found himself more concerned about the broader implications of what Morrison was describing. How do the other guards feel about this? How do the prisoners feel about it? Morrison smiled slightly. "That's exactly the kind of question I hoped you would ask. The success of this program depends entirely on voluntary participation from both sides. Guards who are uncomfortable with the approach will be transferred to other facilities. Prisoners who prefer traditional detention arrangements will continue to receive them. Over the following days, news of the experimental program spread through Camp Henderson in ways that revealed that the complex relationships that had developed between different groups within the facility. Some guards expressed enthusiasm about the opportunity to be part of something innovative and potentially important. Others worried that the program represented a dangerous departure from proven military procedures. Among the prisoners, reactions were equally mixed. Weber and several of the longer-term prisoners expressed cautious interest in participating, viewing the program as an opportunity to prepare themselves for the challenges they would face when the war ended. Some of the newer prisoners, particularly those like Fisher who still harbored resentment about their capture, viewed the program with suspicion. Sullivan found himself in the unusual position of being consulted about which prisoners might be suitable candidates for the program. His months of observation and interaction had given him insights into prisoner personalities and motivations that proved valuable to Morrison and the program planners. Weber is an obvious choice, Sullivan told Morrison during one of their planning sessions. His education, language skills, and natural leadership make him ideal for the teaching components, but I think we should also consider some of the younger prisoners who are still forming their opinions about America and democracy. Morrison made notes as Sullivan spoke. Anyone you think would be problematic? Sullivan thought about Fisher and several other prisoners who had shown signs of persistent hostility toward their captors. Sergeant Fisher isn't ready yet. He's still fighting the war in his head. But I think with time and the right approach, he might come around. The conversation revealed how much Sullivan's understanding of the prisoners had deepened since his early days at the camp. He no longer saw them as a uniform group of enemies, but as individuals with their own personalities, motivations, and potential for growth or change. When the program officially began in early May, Weber was among the first prisoners to volunteer. His initial assignment was to help teach English to newer prisoners who lacked the language skills to participate fully in camp activities. Sullivan was assigned to supervise these sessions, creating a formal working relationship between the two men who had been connected by that moment of crisis months earlier. The English lessons took place in a converted storage room that had been furnished with desks, chairs, and a blackboard salvaged from an abandoned schoolhouse in the nearest town. The setting was hardly elegant, but it served its purpose as a place where German soldiers could begin learning the language and customs of their former enemies. Weber proved to be a natural teacher, patient with students who struggled with pronunciation and encouraging to those who showed aptitude for the language. He had a gift for making abstract grammatical concepts understandable through concrete examples, and he possessed the kind of enthusiasm that made learning engaging rather than tedious. Sullivan watched these sessions with growing admiration for Weber's abilities and growing concern about the ethical complexities of what they were doing. Were they genuinely helping these men prepare for post-war life? Or were they subtly indoctrinating them with American values and perspectives? The question became more pressing when one of Weber's students, a young prisoner named Heinrich, who had been captured during his first month of military service, began asking questions that went beyond simple language instruction. "Teacher Weber," Heinrich said during one lesson, using the formal address that the students had adopted, "why do Americans believe that all men are created equal when they clearly treat different people differently?" Weber glanced at Sullivan, seeking guidance about how to handle such politically sensitive questions. Sullivan nodded slightly, indicating that honest discussion was acceptable within the bounds of the program. "That is a very good question, Heinrich. What makes you think that Americans do not believe in equality?" Heinrich looked nervously at Sullivan before answering. "In my country, we were taught that America keeps some people as slaves, that they do not allow all people to vote or participate in government." James Sullivan carried Weber's poem in his pocket for the rest of his life, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, compassion can bridge any divide. Their story became legend among those who served at Camp Henderson, proof that courage isn't always found on battlefields, but sometimes in the quiet choice to see an enemy as a human being worthy of salvation.